everyone, and welcome to episode 119 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna Lincook, and I'll be your host today, as always. Now, today's episode is going to be about a conference that I co-organised. That was last week. That's if you're listening in September 2023, because that's when it was. And I just wanted to talk about it today. Talk about what it was about, what our intentions were, deciding to put on a conference of Black British history, what it was like, things I learned, and as we move forward into this treacherous time period that we know to be Black History Month, which is literally in a few days' time. You know, I always have a lot to say about Black History Month, but I thought I'd close off this episode with some thoughts following on from this conference, which was called or titled The Issue of Truth Representing Black British History. And it was a 2-day conference organised by myself and a fellow PhD student and friend, Olivia Wyatt. And it was at the Institute of Historical Research, which is in Senate House Library, if you are familiar with the London library scene, as I have found myself very familiar with over the last decade. Decade? Yeah. Wow, I've been in higher education for like nearly a decade. 9 years. That's a long time. Wow. Now, I haven't actually been to that many conferences, especially like the longer 2, 3, 4-day conferences, because, especially not in person, because I started my master's in 2019, which is kind of the time that you start thinking about conferences and the like. And it obviously went into 2020 and there was a pandemic and any conferences that were planned were cancelled. And then in 2021 and even in 2022, a lot of conferences were still online. And it's kind of only, my first year of my PhD, which is last year, that I've started to kind of go to more in-person conferences and kind of see what they're all about. And for anyone that's like not in academia, which is most of you that listen to this podcast, so I'd like to think anyway, conferences, especially in the historical sense and in the academic sense, tend to be made up of panels, and each panel can have anywhere from 2 to 4 people, sometimes more. And it will be roughly brought together by a certain theme, whether that be a time period or a geographical location or someone specific, or a theme or something like that. And those panels will be chaired by somebody who kind of introduces each person and the paper that they give. And a paper is essentially, I think of them as like the podcast episodes I do, like solo episodes, because you essentially are just talking for about, not as long as I talk for maybe on the podcast, but you are speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes conferences have shorter papers, so they'll be like 10 minutes. Sometimes they're longer. And at this conference, they were all 15 minutes, and most panels had about 3 to 4 people on them. And we were talking about and thinking about ideas of truth within histories of Black people in Britain, because I think, especially within public history, and I toe the line a little bit doing a podcast and doing a PhD with public history. Sometimes histories of Black people in Britain often see themselves kind of falling into these generalizations and oversimplifications of historical events or moments or organizations and groups. And I'm sure that there are even things I've said on this podcast in the past, or even more recently, who knows, that kind of play into those generalizations. Generalizations like Windrush, shall we say. Let's take the Windrush narrative. Windrush, in some ways, being a problematic term in itself. It was the name of a ship. Is it the best word to represent essentially a whole generation of people that migrated over 30 or so years? Is the time period that they're given 1948 and kind of ending around I think it's either 63 or 71, I think it's 71, is that a problematic time period? Does this generalise this whole generation of people into this kind of Windrush symbolism of ex-servicemen coming to Britain from the Caribbean, and if you want to generalise it even more, from Jamaica, which people often say instead of the Caribbean? And this narrative, it removes truth. It removes some of the nuances and it removes the complexities of the wider narrative. And history tends to use broad brushstrokes when it comes to public history, and it's not always helpful. And whilst these weren't necessarily the thoughts we had when we were thinking about doing this conference, knowing it would be somewhat an academic endeavour, but we wanted to think about the fact that doing Black British history means a study of minorities, minoritized people in this country, in also a transnational context, so thinking about them coming from other countries, whether that be Africa, the Caribbean, or Asia potentially, and how, we think about these people when we are already in a society and in a space where said people, Black people, are still somewhat minoritized and marginalized in society today. And some of the kind of questions we decided we wanted to throw at the audience and throw at the panelists that would be speaking is to think about, whose truth is being heard and whose is being forgotten whilst we hear those truths that are super loud. How can we change this idea that certain truths are more credible than others, they're more palatable, they're more acceptable in the mainstream? And how do we then depict all the different threads within Black British history and all the truths that are about and maybe exist but haven't been uncovered yet and haven't been researched, as well as these really big overarching narratives. As well as that, we wanted to think about the ways in which we could actually reflect the diversity of opinions, because Black people are not homogenous. Neither are those that do Black British history in their views, and also whether that be, in academia, as activists, within public history, within podcasting and documentary making, there are so many different angles at which to come at these histories. And so how do we then encourage there to be a diversity of thought within these fields and within these stories, especially when, we still want to put out a somewhat united front to move forwards and push, for the further work within these spaces and within these histories. And we also thought a lot about where we get this historical information from. We talked about oral histories and interviewing people and archives and, scholars doing the work. And there were so many academics and lecturers and scholars and public historians and curators in the room that were part of the conversations that we were having. And it was incredible to be around so many people that also had an interest and a care and a passion for history. It made me feel less isolated, and I don't feel as isolated in my work as I have done in the past anymore, and that is actually because I'm part of a few groups of like-minded PhD students doing similar work. We work together and we talk through our work, and even though I would say for most of us, and that is Black people, Black students studying Black British history at UK universities, we tend to be alone. Maybe there's one or two other people that do similar work to us. So it can be quite an isolating experience, but coming together in conferences like the one we had was very nice, because it kind of is a reminder that actually there are loads of people that are doing similar work to you. There are loads of people that are interested in things you're interested in, and they all feel a similar way about the work that they're doing and the lack of, or perceived lack of, other people doing it with them. Now, I didn't want to go through the whole conference panel by panel because I just feel like it doesn't interest anybody. But I will start with the first panel, which was on early modern Black Britain. And in a conversation I had after, I realised, well, I didn't realise just at that moment, but I've always known, but it was brought to my attention that the early modern period is not a period I cover very much on this podcast. And that is because I'm not going to say I don't know what's going on, but I don't know what's going on back then. I stick very comfortably in the 20th century. Any work I do, or there have been episodes I think that fit into the early modern period off the top of my head. I'm thinking I did an episode on Fanny Eaton. Maybe that's not even the early modern period. It probably isn't, I can't remember the dates of that at all. But yeah, just thinking about kind of that time and just generally the earlier presence of Black people in Britain, the work that the scholars that work on that period have to do is just so different to the work that we do in the 20th century. And this obviously, is different for those that work on the 19th and the 18th. But this early modern period, well, that fits into the early modern period. You don't have, and obviously this is me literally stating the most obvious thing ever, but they don't have any sources that are alive. Nobody is still living like I do in the 20th century. I can do oral histories. They could potentially use conversations or interviews that have happened in the past if they have been properly archived. But then it's the thing of, this is hundreds of years worth of material, hundreds of years old, that would have to have been stored and archived and looked after properly for them to be able to do work on it. And we were speaking about the case of some pieces of artwork that were found by Tara Monroe, actually at Leicester. I think it's Leicester Art Gallery, Leicester Museum and Art Gallery. And they were found and they were in really bad condition. They were basically saved from being thrown away. And it's not the first time I've heard about archival, documentary, photograph material about to be thrown away, literally saved from the skip. That is key for mapping out these Black histories. I think there was another case in Leicester with more recent histories from a community centre that was around in like the mid-20th century, the mid-1900s. And it was about to go in the bin and, the names are failing me and I'm so sorry because I really do like to reference the people I'm referring to. But this lady saved it essentially and it is now being archived and it's in the process of being archived in Leicester. And this was a conversation that was spoken about at the Society for Caribbean Studies conference this summer in July. And so there's a lot of things that they have to rely on in this period, and they might be pieces of art, newspaper clippings, records, personal records, diary entries, whatever else. But you've got to, kind of hope and pray that things have been stored correctly. And whilst we have to do the same in the 20th century or any kind of history time period or country or whatever you're looking at in the past, you have to kind of rely on the fact that this has been kept properly so that you can actually access it and use it to its fullest form. But it's even more difficult when these things are from hundreds of years ago. And it just kind of made me think about kind of methods and the way we work and the way we do these histories, especially where you're essentially, and a lot of the work that some of the scholars are doing in the early modern period is actually tracking the Black presence and kind of pinpointing people to different places and actually moving beyond this idea that they would have been enslaved or in servitude. But looking at those that maybe migrated or were born in this country, but by their own kind of choosing or moving because of trade or other patterns at the time that were causing migrations. And there was some really interesting and amazing work done by a few scholars that I really hope will come on the podcast in the next coming months and weeks, because essentially I can't go and research the early modern period to the level in which I would be comfortable to then talk about it on the podcast. So why not invite the people that do this work to come and talk about their work? It just makes more sense, doesn't it? That is part of the plan. And that was one of the beautiful things about the conference. There were just so many people doing things that I know would be of interest to this podcast. And I'm in the process of inviting them all. Naturally, as you'd expect for a conference on Black British history or even a conversation on Black British history, we got into a lot of themes, whether they were, politics, activism, the work of community groups, family, relationships, archives, all that kind of stuff. But one of the conversations that I was really looking forward to and that I was really happy to have witnessed and happy that we kind of organised in a way that was part of the conference was a conversation between Zainab Abbas, who was an activist and from the Black Liberation Front. She was also in the Brixton Black Women's Group, and that they're just like the headlines. There's like a long list of other organisations and groups that Zainab was a part of and work that she did. And her work was transnational. She was in Dar es Salaam at different parts of her career and activism all over the world. And this was in conversation with A.S. Francis, who has been a guest on this podcast before and has a book coming out on Gurleen Bean, who was an activist in the 70s and 80s. And the term activist was a term that we debated, and a contentious term, as we had a panel that we called Scholar Activists, of Professor Hakeem Addy, who's been on the podcast twice before, Dr. Alima Gray and Jade Bentel, and they brilliantly kind of broke down that term and why it's kind of maybe a misused term or a kind of a lazy term to potentially describe anyone that does Black histories, and I say that without the British, more broadly, because it seems like if you're doing a marginalised history, you're an activist, and that's just a paraphrase and not to kind of put words in their mouth. They didn't exactly say that like that, but that in part is what I took from it. And so yeah, that conversation happened. There was Zainab Abbas, as I said, interviewed by A.S. Francis, and during that conversation, I felt like it made me really think about the way I've spoken about historical organisations. I've spoken on here about OAD, I've spoken on here about the Brixton Black Women's Group, on Olive Morris, and some of the individuals that are tied to these groups. And it was really interesting to me because the way that I feel like, I'm not going to say I've been taught history or I've been sold history, but when it's written down in a very, there's only so many ways you can write these histories, and chronologically sometimes is the way, and it's very much a case of, okay, there was this one organisation and then it ended because the people in it couldn't agree on this one thing, so they branched out and they made a new one, and then they left and they went their separate ways and they hated each other. They don't necessarily write, oh, they hated each other, but it kind of feels like it's implied, like, if you're part of this organisation that's doing this one thing, and then you feel like, actually, no, you're not sympathetic to this issue as well, or you're taking this in a direction that I don't want to go in, and you leave, it kind of implies that there potentially could be bad vibes. And Zainab just crushed all of that. And it was just so important to hear, because she was saying that basically when, she was part of one organisation and then she didn't necessarily feel that the politics were moving in the way she wanted to move, they might set up a new organisation. But if that organisation that she was a part of ever needed her or needed them, they would be out on the streets, they would be marching, they would be squatting, they would be doing exactly what they needed to do. And we don't often talk about the crossovers. It's very kind of static and in boxes of, this organisation ran from 1941 to 1948 and that was it, and then it ended on this day. And it never is the case that that's how things end, especially when you're talking about large groups of people that all have different politics and want to do things in a different way, potentially, with all the kind of big overarching goals, and that being Black liberation. So it's really interesting to hear Zainab talk about that, and the way that she's kind of, as a kind of woman living 2023 and having actually lived through this period of activism that is often spoken about in scholarship and historically, her kind of, I guess, distance, maybe reading and listening to those histories, having lived it. And it was really interesting to hear from her, I think. It was probably one of my favourite parts of the conference, I will say, because, yeah, she was just so open about that time period and about some of the work that was happening at that time. And it made me think that I wish actual activism, was done more so like that. And I think there are so many lessons we can learn, which I spoke to Hannah Francis in last week's episode about intergenerational activism and what we can learn from our elders by way of actually making change in society today. And we also had a panel on public historians and curators, and we looked at some of the work that was being done outside of academia by way of podcasts, exhibitions, projects with nature and gardening that all kind of centre the histories of Black people in Britain and also in a transnational context, in the case of Wayland Mackenzie Whittersworth, who looks at America and some of the movements in the States through podcasting. Shout out to him. And also Susan Pitter and Elizabeth Cooper, who work a little bit more within institutions, doing kind of exhibitions for the public, for school children, and for the wider communities that they are trying to serve within their work. And that was really interesting as well. Everything was interesting. It's a redundant statement at this point, because it's kind of easy, I guess, getting caught up in what's been written for academia. And unfortunately, I'd still say, and, not necessarily this is a bad thing, it just kind of is what it is. A lot of the histories written in academia are written for academia and they aren't that accessible to the general public. I say that's not necessarily a bad thing in itself. It is a bad thing because I think it is normally the case that these texts are really expensive behind paywalls, even though they're literally online and accessible by PDF. They are very expensive, and you need the subscriptions, or you need to be in an institution to access them. That's a problem. It's also a problem that a lot of the time scholars can be writing about communities that then can't access the work that's been written about them. And it's a bit of an exploitative practice, I would say, to be just taking and extracting knowledge and extracting these stories and these truths, and then locking them up behind the paywall. And then you kind of have to ask the question of like, well, who benefits then if that's the way history is being written in an inaccessible way? So these people are kind of, actually working within the public realm to present these histories to people, everyday people, shall we say, in accessible ways. And I guess that's what this podcast has always aimed to do as well. But I found it very interesting of the kind of pushback that was mentioned, the pushback from institutions that often kind of say they want to do this work and they really want to, include these diverse histories and decolonize their spaces, but realistically are kind of only paying lip service and want to give you the little tiny corner of the exhibition space to throw in a few black people and call it a day. Again, paraphrasing, nobody actually said exactly that. I don't put words in anybody's mouth, but that's what I took from it. We also had, papers that weren't necessarily from historians, so looking at the peripheries of Black British history, exploring education and then immigration policy and politics and the arts and the media, and that was a really cool panel as well. But we also had a streaming of Empire Road. And I'm not going to say too much about it because I told you I'm inviting people on this podcast, and two of the people I would like to invite, I've said it to them, so this won't come as a shock to them, I hope, is Craig Riley, who is the nephew of Michael Abensets, who wrote Empire Road, which was, I think, the first black kind of written and mostly, Peter Ansels produced it, acted out, the cast and the crew were kind of mostly majority black, and it was the first drama of its type to be commissioned by the BBC, making Michael Abensets the first writer, especially from Caribbean descent, to be commissioned for a TV show by the BBC. And also Dr. Michelle Yaa-Asantewaa, who was also part of the kind of project that was working to kind of bring forth the legacy of Michael Abensets. He has unfortunately passed away, and there was a blue plaque, a Nubian Jack plaque put up for him in 2023 July, so earlier this year. And the family are doing the work to kind of create, I think, more kind of public knowledge of his work, which I think is really important because he did really, really important work. And I think the way we then are able to engage with things like TV shows and see what representation of black people on TV look like and what that says about society at the time and some of the issues, problems or constraints with having, TV shows that actually saw black life being portrayed in a more accurate and sensitive way as well. So that was kind of how we closed the conference. We watched episodes with thanks to the BFI, the British Film Institute, where Empire Road is archived. I think they have a place where you can watch and listen to, I think it's called a sound archive. Yes, Deanna, it's called a sound archive. There's a specific name for the one at the BFI though it's outside of my head right now. But you can go there and listen and watch things that have been, I believe, published within Britain, but that's probably very broad. It's probably a little bit more specific and than that. And that kind of rounded up 2 days of conference. And I think thinking about those 2 days and how nice it was to be around people that also did work on Black British histories and cared about it and were interested in it, even if it wasn't their own kind of specific day-to-day work, it was really, really nice. And I think as we kind of think ahead to Black History Month, where oftentimes it can be very tokenistic and problematic, the way that these histories are kind of pimped out for October and then just shoved back into their little hidey holes, where for the majority of us, we do this work year round, and it is no more or less important in October than any other point in the year. And so I think if you are listening to this podcast and you are thinking about doing something for Black History Month, please just think about what you're doing. And I say that with the most respect to you or your plans, but, think about, does this event have to take place in October? Maybe it does, because maybe it's the only time you're being funded for it. And that's part of the problem. Does this work? Is it something that can happen in other parts of the year? And if it can't, then why not? Why can't you do the thing you want to do during other parts of the year outside of funding? A lot of people worry about, there'll be no interest after October, and I find that so sad. And I don't expect everybody to be interested in Black British history every single day of every single year of every single month. But the fact that it's kind of reserved and pushed aside into October is extremely problematic, and really ties into this commercialized idea of history and the way we take it in. If we have, 1 month for Black histories, another month for queer histories, and another month for this and that, and we tick this box in the workplace, and we cover this thing in this correct time period. I just think it further adds to the commercialization of these histories, and I don't think that's the best way to take them in and to think about Black history, because as we know, and as much as Black history is actually just interesting and history is just interesting, there is also a political element to history. We would be naive to argue that in this country at this present moment in time, Black history doesn't feed into narratives on anti-racism. It doesn't feed into work about equality and, kind of helping marginalised people and especially children see themselves in history. We've spoken about all those things on the podcast before, but the fact that, whilst we know all this to be true in 2023 in today's context, the fact that we then still cram it all into October is a little bit insidious. I didn't want to use the word problematic again, even though that's exactly what it is. It is extremely taxing. I'm going to use the word taxing at certain times to kind of see history kind of, I guess, shoved into boxes in this way. But I'm going to leave it there. I think I've said enough. Episodes where I actually do some research and talk to you about a historical event, moment, person, individual, or theme all resume next week. But with the conference and everything, I figured it might be best placed me to actually talk about it, to reflect on it a little bit. This episode's been a bit like a little oral diary, like an audio diary. Thank you for humouring me if you've made it this far. I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.